It's a long-held belief among tube amp owners that a tube amp sounds best after a period of warm-up. You flip the power switch, you flip the standby switch, and you wait for your amp to warm up. The exact amount of time you're supposed to wait is a moving target. Some people say 30 seconds, some people say 30 minutes. Today I want to find out exactly how long it takes my amp to warm up, and I'm going to do so with something called the Null Test. I won't go into too much detail about what a null test is or why it's used because there are people far more qualified than I who explain it better. In short, you can compare how similar two signals are by flipping the phase on one and summing the two together. In a DAW, that's as simple as going into your channel settings and hitting the 180-degree phase button. Two identical signals that are 180 degrees out of phase with each other will cancel out entirely, and the resulting signal will be silent. If they're not entirely identical, the result will be what's called a null residual, which is any frequency content difference between the two. And if they're not at all identical, there will be no volume difference when they're summed together, whether they're in phase or out of phase. Here's my method. I'm going to create a 30-minute long track in Cubase of a 440 Hz sine wave. I'm going to send the signal from my Tascam interface into this reamp unit and then into the input of my Angle iron ball, which is set to operate at 1 watt. From the Angle's power output, I'm running into this Bugera power soak for two reasons. One, this lets me tap into the signal directly from the power amp so we can measure the performance of the amp's power tubes. And two, I live in an apartment and I don't want to get evicted for noise violations, so I'm also using it to attenuate the signal going to my cab. From the power soak's line out, I'm running back into the Tascam's instrument input onto a new track. Okay, now that that's out of the way. First, I'm going to reamp this 30-minute long track through my Angle after it's been sitting on for about 2 hours so that I have a 30-minute long track of a hot signal from the amp. Then I'm going to turn the amp off and wait 24 hours to ensure that the amp is as cold as it will ever get. Then, with the amp off and cold, I'm going to start both recording playback from the amp and reamping signal to the amp. And then I'm going to hit the power switch and the standby switch so I can capture signal from the amp from a cold start. At this point, I have two signals I can now compare to one another, a 30-minute long hot signal and a 30-minute long signal that goes from a cold start and gradually warms up. And now I can flip the phase on one of these channels and I'll be able to measure from the time the second track starts producing signal to the time the two tracks cancel out how long it takes for the amp to go from cold to hot. I'm going to record cold start amp. Amp's been off all night. Let's start recording. Amp's heating up. There's the signal. Let's zoom in here. Yep. Okay, now we're going to let this run for 30 minutes. And we'll examine it later. So, the results of this test were pretty interesting, but before I talk about them, I want to address something you'll see in the footage. I had to lower the volume of the cold amp track because there was a gain discrepancy while recording it this morning. I wanted to avoid something like this, but I don't think it affects the results. The two tracks are canceling out towards the end of the 30-minute mark, which is exactly what I want anyway. Towards the beginning of the track, you can see the waveform of the cold amp, a transient where I hit the power switch, and a gradual swell where it begins producing signal. As this happens and the two tracks sum together, the resulting output gets quieter until we get our residual. Here's the interesting part. At regular playback volumes, the residual is buried under the noise floor as soon as the cold amp begins playing back at full volume. The difference between the signal from the hot amp and the cold amp is so minuscule that I doubt anybody would actually be able to tell the difference without a test like this. However, if I increase the gain of the results, you'll hear that the residual under the noise floor persists until around the 16-minute mark. So now we know that it takes 16 minutes for this amp to warm up to as hot as it'll ever be. What's more interesting is that the residual comes back briefly at the 18-minute mark. Then it disappears again a moment later, then it comes back. This cycle repeats for the duration of the test. I don't really have an explanation for this. It could be a very slow, subtle phase shift or amplitude shift or extra harmonic content difference between the two tracks, but at this point I had to have my monitor cranked so loud to hear it that I doubt that it has any real-world implications. So, there you go. Among the old wives' tales that guitarists tell themselves is a nugget of truth. It does actually take a few minutes for a tube amp to warm up. But given the difference is so small, I don't think anybody can actually tell. I'd be really interested in seeing this test repeated with different amps at different wattages to see if some amps do need more or less time to warm up. Anyway, that's all I got. I need to get to band practice. I'll see you later.